Have a closer look at the Tomek knife jig. And you will see that the lower fixed jaw of the clamp is shifted downwards from the center line of the jig shaft. Tomek does this on purpose. Thanks to this offset, when you clamp a common kitchen knife that is typically 2.5 millimeter at the spine, its edge is centered in the clamp. And thanks to that, you grind even bevels of the same height on both sides of the blade. Other brands of slow bed grinders do not have this offset in their knife jigs. I cannot say for all the brands, but for example, the Triton knife jig has no offset. And as you can see, its lower fixed jaw of the clamp is exactly at the jig shaft center line. And when you grind a knife with it, you get asymmetric bevels of different height. The Tomek knife jig is not self-centering. Because of that, asymmetric bevels in thicker knives is a common issue. Generally speaking, the jig centers a blade which thickness at the spine is twice the distance between the jig fixed floor and the jig shaft center line. If the blade is not centered in the jig, you get one bevel higher than other. A blade thicker than 205 millimeter has its edge above the center line, and this results in a higher bevel on the downside, on the side that is lying on the fixed jaw of the clamp. Tomek has two versions of the knife jig SVM45, produced prior to 2016 and after. The knife jig they produce after 2016 is slim compared to the older jig. Tomek dealers stock both of them. And when you buy a knife jig in your country, there is no way to know what version of the knife jig you've got till you open the box. In New Zealand, recently one guy bought two knife jigs, and when he opened them at home, one was the older jig and the other the slim new jig. These versions of the knife jigs have different offset from the center line. So offset from the center line in the knife jig you have can be from 1.05 to 1.25 millimeter. Multiply by 2 and you see that a knife with a blade 2.1 to 2.5 millimeter at the spine will be centered in the knife jig, and you get bevels of even height on it. Tomek long knife jig SVM140 has offset of approximately 1.5 millimeter and centers blades 3 millimeter at the spine. I can tell you that no matter what version of the SVM45 knife jig you have, you will grind nicely looking, near symmetric bevels on blades from 2 to 3 millimeters thick at the spine. These are the common kitchen knives. Where a knife is thinner than 2 millimeters, like this one, put several layers of cloth tape on the spine where you clamp it. Over here. To bring thickness to 2.2 millimeters, and the blade will clamp centered. Like this. And the blade will clamp centered. Using the Tormek long knife jig SVM 140, put several layers of cloth tape on the spine to bring its thickness to 3 mm, and the blade will clamp centered. Obviously, for knives thicker than 3 mm, we need to modify the jig to make it center the blade. In our workshop, we use 4 knife jigs. Jig number 1 is the unmodified SVM 45 for up to 3 mm thick knives, like common kitchen knives. Jig number 2 is modified for 3 to 4 mm thick knives. Jig number 3 is modified for 4 to 5 mm thick knives. And jig number 4 is for 5-7 mm thick knives. Jig number 1. This is the stock Tormek knife jig SVM 45. As is, and it centers blades up to 3 mm thick. Jig number 2 has a 0.5 mm recess in the fixed jaw of the clamp. This jig centers 3 to 5 mm thick blades. This is the 0.5 mm recess. Jig number 3. The third jig has 1 mm recess in the fixed jaw, and this jig centers 4 to 5 mm thick blades. This is the 1 mm recess. Clamps in the Tormek knife jig are not thick enough to make a recess deeper than 1 mm. You see, even when we make a 1 mm recess, we get a sharp edge. Because of that, the fourth jig is an adapted Triton long knife jig that has thicker clamp, with a 3 mm recess in the fixed jaw of its clamp. The Triton jig has no offset. With this recess, spacing from the center line of the shaft to the bottom of this jig is 3 mm, making it ideal for knives 6 mm thick at the spine, but can be used for 5 to 7 mm thick knives as well. In the Triton jig, I also had to grind off part of this screw to flatten it, because it was in the way when sharpening at low angles. At the moment, we have no knife jig that would clamp centered blades over 7 mm at the spine. A note on jigs number 2 and 3. When you clamp a knife 3 to 4 mm thick at the spine, first try the jig number 2 and see if you grind symmetric bevels of the same height on both sides. If the grind is not symmetric, try the jig number 3, as it may give better results. Because of the production tolerances, knife jigs have slightly different measurements, and the jig number 3 may work better for the 3 to 4 mm thick blade. More on this in the next part of the video. This part of the video is for those who seek for the utmost accuracy. The problem is actually worse than what I have told you. Not only the offset is different in older and newer versions of the Tormek knife jig, but even inside these two groups of knife jigs, the offset varies from jig to jig due to the production tolerance. Because of that, if you want accurate centering, you need to measure offset in the knife jig that you use. It is impossible to accurately measure the offset directly, and we use the following method. Measurement 1. Thickness from the back of the fixed jaw to the top of the jig shaft. Measurement 2. Thickness of the knife jig lower fixed jaw. Measure the thickness in its flat segment, the thickest part. Measurement 3 is diameter of the shaft. The nominal shaft diameter is 12 mm, but due to the production tolerance, it can be from 11.7 to 12.1 mm. The important dimension here is the radius, so we have to divide this number by 2. How we calculate the offset? First, calculate distance from the top of the shaft to the face of the lower fixed jaw. It is difference between the measurement 1 and measurement 2. So measurement 1, 15.95, minus measurement 2, 8.80, equals the value of 7.15 millimeters. And next, we calculate offset from the center line. It is difference between the value 7.15 millimeters and the radius of the jig shaft 5.86 millimeters. So we take 7.15 millimeters, subtract 5.86 millimeters and get the jig offset of 1.29 millimeters. So this my jig has offset from its shaft center line of 1.29 millimeters. Do the same measurements and calculation for each knife jig that you use and write it down. Now that we know the exact offset in our jigs, the unmodified jig number 1 ideally centers knives 2.5 to 2.6 millimeters thick at the spine. The offset multiplied by 2 gives us 2.58. Jig number 2 with 0.5 millimeter recess, ideally centers knives 3.5, 3.6 millimeter thick at the spine. The offset plus 0.5 millimeter recess multiplied by 2 gives us 3.58. Jig number 3 with 1 millimeter recess, ideally centers knives 4.5, 4.6 millimeter thick at the spine. Offset plus 1 millimeter recess multiplied by 2 gives 4.58. Put on, where you clamp a knife, as many layers of a cloth tape as needed to bring the spine of the blade to this ideal thickness for the jig. For example, if the knife spine at where you clamp has thickness 3 millimeter, you use the jig number 2 that ideally centers knives 3.5, 3.6 thick at the spine, and put 3-4 layers of cloth tape on the spine to bring the blade thickness to this ideal 3.5 millimeter. We do not modify knife jigs for sale in our workshop. Any local machining shop at your place can mill the 0.5 millimeter and 1 millimeter recess for you using an end mill like this one. Bring them 2 Tomek knife jigs disassembled. Give them only the lower part and draw a line in front of the pins with a permanent marker to show them where to mill. Tell them to mill flush to the pins. It is okay to touch the pins, but they should not leave unmilled area in front of the pins. Show them a photo from my website to illustrate what needs to be done. You can go to this web page either from the equipment we use or from the front page on our website. As a matter of fact, 0.5 millimeter you can file away yourself. This is how I made my first modified knife jig as a proof of concept in 2016 when I was thinking of a solution for the centering problem. We still use this jig in our workshop. What I did, I used a metal file and filed away, frequently checking the thickness till it reached 0.5 millimeter. However, it is impossible to accurately file off 1 millimeter from the clamp. You probably can do it on a belt sander yourself, but milling gives better precision. If you have to sharpen knives over 5 millimeter thick at the spine, obtain the Triton long knife jig and ask them to mill off 3 millimeter from its fixed lower jaw in front of the pins. As with Tomek knife jigs, give them only the lower part. Knives may come from the maker with the edge not at the center of the blade. It is easy to see. Hold the knife with the tip upward and check if the edge line is at the center or not. You will be surprised how many knives have the edge off the center, especially where the knives are made with manual forging and grinding. When you find yourself in an unfortunate situation of sharpening a knife with the off-center edge, there is no universal fix. How we compensate for that? Clamping the jig by the blade spine thickness, and start grinding as usual. Having beveled halfway, check on which side you get a lower bevel. Suppose we get a lower bevel here. So we reclamp this side down. Often this alone helps. So you continue grinding and check again. If the bevel facing the fixed jaw of the clamp still grinds lower than on the other side, you need to place a shim under the blade. This makes the bevel higher on this side and eventually grind nice looking symmetric bevels of even height on both sides, even when the edge is not in the center. The shim is placed on the lower fixed jaw of the clamp. As shims, we use feelers from a feeler gauge. With smaller knives, when a shim is too long, we simply cut it to the size. As to the thickness of the shim, there is no rule. By my experience, the shim thickness should be roughly 3/5 of the bevel height difference. For example, if the difference in height of the bevels on sides of the blade is 0.5 mm, place a 0.3 mm shim. I know that our solution is not easy to implement, but there is no easy way to clamp a knife centered. Many have followed our method and are happy with the results. I've watched multiple attempts to create self-centering knife jig for Tomek, prototypes made, and some even for sale, but none has been satisfactory so far. Tomek probably thinks that a self-centering knife jig will come overly expensive to make and will be hard to sell. The best design of a manually centered jig I've seen is by Michael Peppard, and Michael has made a working prototype, but it has never made it to the production. Thanks for watching and happy sharpening!